couple of weeks ago, I participated in a program with Christopher, and he introduced himself in this a little bit unusual fashion, and I like it. So I would like to repeat it to be more welcoming to everybody, and especially to those who cannot clearly see us, but basically to provide a bit more information about myself. So I'm a white heterosexual woman. I use pronouns she, her, and I'm wearing, I think, a dark top with a scarf. I have brown hair. And I also, and in case you are wondering about my accent, it's Eastern European. I was born in Poland. So saying all of that, I would like to begin my talk. Maybe I can share my screen now. So, Middlebury doesn't necessarily strike me as a place which would be a driver of national transformation. It is small, rural, away from major cultural centers. So for those of us who are not familiar with Vermont and Middlebury itself. But during 1990s, two at the time local lawyers, Susan Murray and Beth Robinson, launched a movement that led to Vermont marriage equality in 2009, and then subsequently to legalization of same-sex marriage nationwide on June 26, 2015. There was also another Middlebury resident, Jeffrey Kaufman, at the time also resident. Now he lives, I think, on the other coast, who produced a film, The State of Marriage, which is a documentary, wonderful documentary about 2 decades long struggle that built the foundation for the entire marriage equality movement. But 200 years earlier, in a neighboring community, small village, Waybridge, there were 2 women living together, accepted as married couple, but without benefit of the law. Their names were Charity Bryant and Sylvia Drake, and their life and story will be the subject of my talk today. And now in Middlebury, we store the collection of records which document life of these women. So there are all these little things which come together in regards to Middlebury. But there is another coincidence. About 10 years ago, Rachel Hope Cleaves was vacationing in nearby Lake Dunmore, and she decided to come to town and check the local museum. And as many of you know, and may be familiar with this book, Rachel Hope authored this book and published it in 2014. She's now a professor of history at University of British Columbia. And this book made story of Charity and Sylvia really well known. So when I would like to read just a tiny little paragraph from her book, when she enters the museum. So 10 years ago, that means it was around 2004, I believe, I walked into the door of the Henry Sheldon Museum on a sunny afternoon. The entrance way was unremarkable, but something in the air set my senses tingling. You know, I said, there are great treasures waiting to be discovered in local museums like that. It was entirely by accident that I stumbled across a story of Charity and Sylvia a year later, and I found out that their papers were archived at the Sheldon. The accident she's referring to is when she was doing her dissertation, she came across a description by William Cullen Bryant, a well-known romantic poet, of his visit in Vermont to see his aunt, Charity Bryant, and her companion, Sylvia. I will later quote this description, but what caught Rachel Hope Cleaves' attention was not only like sheer beauty of description of this visit, but also very direct reference to the women's intimate relationship, which was obviously during early 19th century very unusual. Unfortunately, I don't know, the way I see it, our founder, Henry Sheldon, is a bit obscure. I don't know if you see the same view. So here is Henry Sheldon Museum of Vermont History in Middlebury, which was established by enthusiast of local history and collector, Henry Luther Sheldon in 1882. And the museum is now considered the oldest community museum in the country. Henry, as we refer to him often among staff, was born in 1821, and this summer we'll be celebrating bicentennial of his birth. So please remember about us. We will have great exhibits and programming and things going on to celebrate this occasion. But although you may see him here holding deck of cards, leisurely activity, this man wasn't an idle man. He understood the value of local history and devoted last decades of his life to collecting all kinds of documents, family papers, books, photographs, maps, and material objects. And he made sure that local people knew about that. So eventually this collecting passion led to amassing a pretty amazing historical collection that counts as one of the finest in Vermont. But when in 1897, he was presented with a trunk full of family papers and memorabilia related to two local women, Charity and Sylvia, he couldn't have imagined that these materials will be studied with such intensity and interest over a century later, not only but because of specific relation which these two women enjoyed. The trunk which he was presented arrived from a household of late Asaph Drake, older brother of Charity. This beautiful building still stands on by Morgan Horse Farm Road. I just took this picture a few days ago. In our archives, we had archival photograph, dark and gloomy, and I thought that it was much nicer presentation of this house. So in this house, Sylvia spent last several years of her life after Charity passed away in 1851. Sylvia moved with her ailing brother, and she herself passed away in 1868. Unfortunately for us, about 30 years later, the tenants of this house, rather than dispose these papers, as many of us do after relative dies, they pass the trunk to Henry Sheldon. So this is my kind of rendition of how this content of the trunk may have looked like. Right now, this collection is organized beautifully into archival folders, into specific themes, and stored in our cold storage of our archival cold storage. But the trunk included diaries, church records, tailoring business records, and voluminous correspondence. The collection includes about 400 letters, which both women received during their lifetime. There were also a couple of different silhouettes. You can see this funny silhouette unfortunately, we don't know who this person is. it was only signed Drake woman. There were many Drake women, so it's hard to know which one specifically it was. But also this, among these papers was this beautiful double silhouette of Charity and Sylvia that now is considered the earliest image of gay couple in United States. So I will talk about it a bit later. But our archives also include several other collections which kind of complement this main Bryant Drake collection, including Asaph Drake papers, Waybridge Congregational Church records. Women were part of this church, belonged to the church, various hair mementos, and a life-size cradle, which came from the household of Charity and Sylvia. This collection just is incredibly rich with so much information, not only tracing the lives of these two women and their intimate life, but also their involvement in local community, relationship with neighbors and families, but also in general, it documents rural women at this time of history. And the value of this collection is that, as we know, there were many people who lived in same-sex unions across the country. The value of this collection is that it exists and it's so rich, so we can really read about them, and therefore, you know, it's worth really researching and digging for all kinds of information. Despite this richness of this collection, we really don't know how these two women look like. So these are this outline of profiles from the cover of the book. There are some tidbits of information here and there, how they may have looked, but it's interesting that we don't seem to have any photographs of them, especially because photography was invented in late 1830s. It arrived fairly quickly to Middlebury because our collection has sizable collection of daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, and early photography. And two women lived kind of overlapped with this era, but somehow either didn't choose to get photographed or they are not identified. But as you may know, silhouette art was thriving in pre-photography era. It was a less expensive way of getting your image into some sort of your image rendered and have. Obviously, not everybody was able to afford being painted by and sit in front of artists and pay huge amount of money. It was reserved usually to people with means. So silhouette art basically thrived here and everywhere else in the country. And thanks to this largely obscured right now form of art, we have at least these two profiles. We can kind of look and think about these women. As you can see, they are almost identical. But the book by Rachel Hope opens with this beautiful description where she invites the reader to really look for a while. And once you start looking, you see much more into these two profiles. They really differ. The woman on the right is a little bit more robust, a little thicker maybe, and woman on the left appears to be more delicate, which from description of these two women, we know that Charity was much more playing this so-called traditional male role, while Sylvia was shy and maybe a little bit in the shadow and performed more traditional duties then kind of comparable to traditional role of women, of men and a woman. But obviously it's a pure speculation. We usually in a museum referred to this collection was known as Charity and Sylvia. And then to reverse and refer to these particular, silhouettes by Sylvia and Charity creates sometimes problem, but I'm trying to always pay attention to it, although we really don't know, and maybe we may never know which one is which. Charity and Sylvia first met in Waybridge in the spring of 1807. It was a rural community and still is adjacent to Middlebury. But both women were born in Massachusetts in close vicinity to each other. Charity was born in North Bridgewater in close, now Brockton, southwest of Boston in 1777. Sylvia was born 7 years later in Easton in 1784. Both Drake and Bryant families were severely affected by aftermath of Revolutionary War. The Drakes suffered acutely, and the family basically became insolvent, and several older siblings of Sylvia had to hire themselves to other households in order to survive. Sylvia was the youngest child, stayed with her mother. In time, Asaph, I mentioned earlier, Sylvia's older brother, traveled to central Vermont. It was a new community with opportunities. He was very industrious, eventually married into prominent local family, the Beldens, and achieved financial success here in Waybridge. In time, Sylvia and her mother followed, and then a few other siblings to Vermont. Charity was also the youngest of the family, and her mother, named Silence, interesting that women had these interesting names, died during childbirth. And her father, Dr. Bryant, very soon after remarried. So Charity was raised by father and stepmother. It wasn't a happy childhood, and also Charity was displaying very independent spirit. She had keen interest in self-education, literature, poetry. She was not inclined to pursuing traditional path expected of women at that time. So it sort of added to tension in the house. In post-revolutionary era in America, there were not that many opportunities for women outside of marriage. But also American society was undergoing pretty profound transformation. So here it's our own, we can call her, but she wasn't our own, a great example, Emma Willard, who arrived to Middlebury to teach in Middlebury Female Academy. And then she opened her own boarding school here. This was the time when many such schools for girls were opening across New England, and Middlebury was one of them. And obviously Emma Willard is known for her progressive reforms that she introduced into education of girls, including geography, astronomy, other sciences. Charity always, as I said, displayed interest in writing and in poetry. That was sort of family tradition. Her grandfather and later also her nephew, William Colin, was also very much, obviously, a poet. But as Rachel Hope Cleaves in her book points out, women, many of these schools sometimes attracted women who were less interested maybe in marriage, more interested in being with other women and pursuing their intellectual interests. And what happened that in some cases, women who had limited interaction with outside world developed also, there was sort of like a place where they developed intense infatuation with each other and in some cases highly emotional relationships, especially in case of Charity. Charity appeared to have this very independent, fascinating personality. And the collection traces relationship with several women, which appear to be much more than just pure friendships. One of them one of these women was a teacher, Lydia Richards, with whom Charity maintained pretty close relationship, and for several years prior to arriving to Middlebury. When Charity was at some point planning her trip to Vermont, I just would like to say also that because part of Drake's family still remained in Boston vicinity, Charity developed friendship with one of Sylvia's sisters, and eventually this sister, Polly, relocated to Vermont and invited Charity to visit. And that's important for our story. But when Charity was leaving, being invited to visit Vermont, we have this little piece of a scrap of paper, and I try to select documents which are a little bit more kind of interesting visually. For those of you who are not familiar with archival documents, sometimes they are scruffy and kind of there is a lot of content usually which they provide, but they are not necessarily beautiful to display and enjoy. But in this case, this is this little poem which Charity wrote, Adieu. She was also writing, this is also an acrostic. Acrostic is the form of verse where you, when you can read in vertically, it will spell some meaning. So it's adieu this way and adieu this way. And she obviously says, it's not easy to read, adieu, my friend, but but though we are doomed to part, distance shall never divide you from my heart. That wasn't completely true, because when Charity came to Vermont, she kind of decided she's not going to maintain a relationship with Lydia. However, that was interesting because despite the heartbreak, these women became, three of them, Sylvia, Charity, and Lydia, became long friends for many years. And we have, I think, about 180 letters in our collection from Lydia. But as I mentioned, all these emotional and kind of relationship which Charity was developing with women in various schools where she was teaching, eventually led to some sort of gossip and personal difficulties. And I think at some point the situation was such that she really welcomed getting out and coming to Vermont, because gossip at the time was kind of kiss of death for a woman, and obviously she wanted to avoid it. So she traveled to Vermont, where to visit her friend Polly. And this is a map of Waybridge from 1857. And kind of you can see that in the center of the village, there is a cemetery, Waybridge Hill Cemetery. That's why the women, both women are right now buried. Asaph Drake House is here. Congregational Church is also close to the center of town. And then there is Hagar Farm, which is an important place to kind of visualize when you think about these two women. But few words about Waybridge at the time. Waybridge settled in mid-1770s, but enjoyed very rapid growth and burgeoning prosperity. So when Charity arrived there, that's the situation. Its population soared from 175 in 1790 to 750 in 1810. There were several grist mills, but basically mainly the economy was crop farming, lumbering, sheep grazing, and eventually the two women provided tailoring business, which was incredibly welcome in this community, which obviously needed to be clothed. Fortunately, Charity, aside from her teaching skills and intellectual abilities, she also learned how to cut and make clothes. And when she met Sylvia, we don't know exactly what happened, but very quickly they developed a relationship, and this skill of, and Charity was able to employ her skills and earn money by making clothes, and Sylvia joined her as her assistant. Here they are documents, which basically scraps of paper, but for those interested how businesses were conducted, this is just kind of mine of information. So tailoring was incredibly useful skill, provided very needed services in small village throughout their lives. The women supported themselves with this, with cutting and making clothes. Charity was an expert cutter of many different clothes: vests, coats, pantaloons, women gowns, cloaks and bonnets. And Sylvia was a seamstress. Later on, local young women, they hired local young women. So again, I'm talking to you about that a little bit just to show in what way they were kind of ingraining themselves in community and why they were needed. And this skill was absolutely essential to Waybridge and surrounding areas, and therefore they provided this much needed business, plus employed local young women, which was also welcome. Interesting thing was that making clothes for men was usually reserved for male tailors, but Charity and Sylvia were able to assert themselves with their expert skills and also meticulous accounting system. They soon expanded the cottage where they lived. They I think I skipped, or I think I forgot to tell you that that when Charity and Sylvia met, a few months later, they rented a room together, and eventually they built a cottage, leasing a quarter of an acre from on Hagar Farm. On this map to the left, there was this land where they were fortunate to do it, because obviously they didn't have capital to buy or to somehow. This was very fortunate because the farm, Hagar Farm, was managed by a woman. And this woman, the women became friends, and by leasing this land, they were able to live for over 40 years in peace, and it was mutually beneficial to all parties. Eventually, this cottage was expanded at first it was only like a place 12 by 12 feet, supposedly, so extremely tiny and in this middle of nowhere, but eventually that was expanded, and many of young women actually lived in this house and help with the business. There is one, as I mentioned, we have several diaries by these women, but there is one which sort of pertains to what I'm talking about. It was kind of striking to me, this phrase, especially because it was written, this note was made on February 1821, that means 200 years ago. And so 200 years ago, when women still struggled to assert the value of their work, Sylvia, who appeared to be shy and kind of not very assertive, wrote the following: hard work and close calculation will not accumulate properties unless you have confidence and disposition to demand something for your labor. So it's an interesting, assertive comment by this young woman. Here it's another ledger where they listed meticulously all little kind of, transactions. There was a lot of bartering going on. So they provided clothing, someone else paid in eggs or in some other labor. So this is also interesting insight in the local economy of this time. Another place where these two women contributed to local economy and played an important role was church. Waybridge at the time had barely some sort of forming church, but in next few years there will be large expansion, and but here it's early 19th century. However, you can see that right here, so this is a constitution of this female benevolent society. But what's interesting about it, Charity and Sylvia are the first one on the list. And I have a number of documents where it's clearly looks like they played leadership role in variety of organizations. There were some charitable organizations. Almost always their names appear like first in the row, and also in this order: Charity, Bryant, and Sylvia Drake. Charity is always on the top, but both women appear on all kinds of documents, despite the fact that in traditional marriage, often there was a husband who just was signing document, but they always equally did it together. Sylvia, another interesting tidbit of information is that this local church, it was small. Ministers were usually itinerant ministers. Community didn't have much money to pay them, so there was a lot of tension and kind of many of these ministers were coming and going. But Charity and Sylvia almost always developed a really friendly relationship with ministers. They were having dinners with them, and after they left, they corresponded profusely. So it was interesting that these women were always welcome and welcoming others and creating. They were not living in isolation. They were right in center of all kinds of activities. I mentioned many poems. Both women wrote poems. Sylvia usually appeared to be more religious, so there is a lot of religious undertones. But here I just would like to highlight a couple of those written by Charity that indicate very tender love for her companion, and also often acute anxiety over possible potential separation. From what we know, these two women spent over 44 years together, but only once were apart for three days. We don't have any evidence that it ever happened again. And it happened right at the beginning of the relationship, where Sylvia traveled to visit her mother in Bristol, like 10 miles away. And here, this another acrostic, and again, you can maybe see that this lettering, vertical lettering, forms Sylvia Drake. So it spells basically Sylvia's name. So here it says, "Send, gracious heaven, thy best of blessings send, ye guardian powers, protect my lovely friend." So that's this one. And then another one, which is really beautiful, and it's written at the bottom. You can see an acrostic written by a firelight on the prospect of speedy separation, March 1818. After 10 years of living in Vermont, a family in Massachusetts was asking Charity to visit a family, and it appeared at first that it was consideration that Charity will travel on her own. So this acrostic was written with anxiety of this possible separation. So here again, it's you can see Sylvia Drake spelling. And here it may be difficult for you to read. It says, "Sweet girl, my heart is yours by every tie, yours in an hour of sorrow and of joy. Loaded with grief, it still would on you rest, vent all its sorrows on your friendly breast." Eventually, Sylvia joined Charity, so there was no separation at all. So this is again, this one of those documents which you probably wouldn't admire unless I kind of put it in front of you and explain what it is, because it's hard to make up what it is really about. I didn't mention that Charity, who was kind of obviously dealing with a lot of upset from years ago, when there was a lot of gossip about her relationship with other women. She repeatedly asked her correspondents to destroy all her letters. She kept a log of her letters, and we know that during her lifetime she wrote about 1,500 of letters. From what we know in existence, there are about 30 left. But this is sort of a brief note, biographical notes, which she later in life she left behind. And again here, it is very difficult to read, but there are a couple of significant statements. So she says here, "Miss Drake, who consented to my helpmeet, to be my helpmeet." Helpmeet, basically, helpmeet meant wife, and consented means often, I mean, the marriage of from this time, consenting to a relationship meant basically to form formal marriage and relationship. So referring to Sylvia as helpmeet being synonym for wife is quite significant. And I won't be discussing this sort of historical significance of various vocabularies and how marriage was seen, and how all of this really, if you are interested in in going deeper into this issue. The book by Rachel Hope is very much scholarly research, writing about these kind of things, and also Rachel Hope Cleaves was here in 2014 and gave a talk at Middlebury College, so specifically about this subject. So if you are ever interested, I'd be happy to provide you with links where you can listen to it. Yes. There is one more tiny little scrap of paper here from a position of Sylvia, who is clearly practicing her signature and kind of fancy taking name of Charity, because it says Bryant Charity, Bryant Sylvia, Bryant Sylvia, Bryant Charity. So it's sort of a little piece of information, which kind of insight about how the women, related to each other. Here it's another interesting historical kind of piece of information. Asaph Drake, the older brother of Sylvia, was very kind of supportive throughout their life, and obviously, took Sylvia at the end of her life to his home. It doesn't mean that always it was like Shangri-La for everybody. There were a number of siblings who felt very uncomfortable visiting women. For example, Sylvia's mother was very uncomfortable for first few years, and it took a couple of years before she ever visited the women in the cottage. But Asaph was very religious, very devout, but very supported man. And here in the middle of his journal, he writes the following, which sort of states again about how he valued contribution of both of these women to local society. And he says the following: "My sister Sylvia has not married. Began in early life in company Miss Drake, Miss Charity Bryant, a tailoress originally of Bridgewater, Massachusetts. They commenced business in Waybridge together, have appeared, enjoy each other's society, and to say the least, had done so much to build and keep society together, considering their means as any other two individuals." Here is another description which I mentioned at the beginning, which led Rachel Hope Cleaves to really exploration of this collection. William Cullen Bryant visited both women on a number of occasions and eventually published in his Letters of a Traveler in 1850 the following description. I just will read to you just a little bit in case you cannot see clearly. So he says here, "In their youthful days, they took each other as companions for life, and how this union, no less sacred to them than the tie of marriage, has subsided in an uninterrupted harmony for 40 years, during which they have shared each other's occupation and pleasures and works of charity while in health, and watch over each other tenderly in sickness." And then again, how they slept on the same pillow and had a common purse and adopted each other's relations, and how one of them, more enterprising and spirited in her temper than the other, might be said to represent the male head of family, and took upon herself their transactions with the world without, until the length her health failed, and she was tended by her gentle companion as a fond wife attends her invalid husband. So I hope you agree that this is one of the most beautiful description of a union between two people, and the fact that it was published. Obviously, he felt a bit of trepidation publishing it, but I know that this volume Sylvia kept throughout her life, and unfortunately, it never was passed to us, so we don't have this original book with us, but obviously this is not difficult to obtain, this particular volume. I'm just checking my time. Oh my gosh, I will speed up. Now, Henry Sheldon died in 1907 in a museum closed to the public for over 30 years. When it reopened, this peculiar object was put on display. So when Sylvia also moved from cottage after Charity died to Asaph House, she left behind this particular cradle, and Hagar's later gave it to Sheldon Museum, and it's basically in our collection right now. It still maintains this beautiful bottle green and emerald green stain, and here in the middle you can see and maybe we can imagine, but I assume it would be perhaps Sylvia's hand which rocked Charity, who was often really sickly, to basically soothe her pains. Charity, both women were actually not the greatest health, but Charity was particularly dealing with a lot of health issues, and there is a great chapter in the book about 19th century medicine, and it's really pretty amazing that people really survive all the mercury pills and laudanums and opiums and all kinds of poisons on the top of everything, bloodletting and vomiting and all kinds of other strange things. But these two women experience it all and practice it very much. So this is this unusual life-size cradle, which definitely came from their parlor. So when the museum reopened, there were also reactions, because this led to kind of digging into the collection, and Burlington Free Press published an article that these two women were devoted to each other and are buried side by side. In 1953, another Vermont Quarterly mentioned that the women were strongly attracted to each other and basically lived together. But the first person who really experienced, who openly explored sexual nature of the relationship was Rachel Hope Cleaves in this book, which I referred to several times. Publication of the book was very popular immediately after publication, and this double silhouette became basically celebrity in its own, because reviews appeared in all kinds of papers, including, Boston Globe, Washington Post, eventually, London Guardian, even some newspaper in Denmark requested this silhouette. So it's all of a sudden it was like the most popular image ever. It is a very unusual silhouette because obviously it portrays women. Usually there is a single silhouette, single person. Occasionally there are married couple which appear on the silhouette, and it's in this case it's really pretty intricate, and I'm pretty sure that women put it together, because it's consists of these two separate pieces of paper. Even the paper, it's a late paper, early 19th century, going in opposite direction, hollow silhouette laid over black fabric, and then there is this matting or a window, beautifully sort of carved, and surrounded by meticulously braided hair looped in the shape of heart. It is just a pretty stunning piece of art, one can say. So when I first came and saw this about 10 years ago, it was taken out of frame. I'm sure there was once framed by them and probably was hanging in the room. You can see this pink, intense pink versus faded pink. Unfortunately, museums often took a lot of artwork out of, because of storage, out of their frames, and we don't have original frame. But several years ago, in partnership with Middlebury College Art Museum, we were able to preserve this beautiful, delicate piece. And during this process, it was beautiful frame was specifically designed following the period from which this specific silhouette was coming from, and it's enclosed in this vacuum to deter moisture and protected by also period glass, reverse painted glass for presentation and for preservation. This it also became a part of several exhibits. It was exhibited during Middlebury College during American Portraiture large exhibit, and then a couple of years ago, Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery also included it in the show Blackout Silhouettes Then and Now, and it traveled to several other museums. It is now in cold storage and resting, but during this summer at the Bennington Museum of Art, it will be parked for 2 months on display as part of their show Love, Marriage and Divorce. So if you would like to see it, that will be a great occasion to do it. I'm almost done. Again, Asaph Drake House. Some time ago, someone from Drake family, located elsewhere, sent us this photograph, and saying that in a family tradition, they always refer to this elderly woman as Aunt Sylvia. So it was just momentary kind of super excitement, because all of a sudden you can see Sylvia, her face, and obviously, this is just incredibly exhilarating moment. Very soon we realized that this photograph couldn't have been taken before 1868, confirmed by historian of costume. But upon further examination, I found out that this woman was a daughter of Asaph Drake. That means a niece to Sylvia Drake. And she lived with Asaph. She never married, and she took care about elderly Sylvia. And when I said at the beginning that that trunk arrived to Sheldon Museum in 1897, turns out that Sylvia Louisa died in 1896. So probably she died and family decided to basically pass the trunk away. The women are buried in the cemetery, the Central Cemetery, Waybridge Hill Cemetery, in under one headstone. This is a family splurge for this particular headstone. Its letters are embossed, not carved in, which supposedly is more expensive. And it's interesting that they decided to bury them together. And it's actually one of the more beautiful headstones I've ever seen. And now in April, I remember last year someone planted pink tulips. So if you are around and visiting this cemetery and seeing this beautiful headstone, may be a wonderful time, springtime, to visit. So So here it is. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, the beautiful talk. I have been, I think, 3 times now to the cemetery, and it's a very moving experience to see them together. And so I really appreciate the work that you've done on bringing their story back to life. Because it was certainly, people were walking through that cemetery for decades without recognizing who these women were.
Yes, if I may just finish, I forgot to say something. May I quickly? So I just had this. I just wanted to finish it nicely, like a bow over the some present. I was just wanted to say that hopefully to all of you, when you visit museum like ours, that something will set your senses tingling, as it happened to Rachel Hope Cleaves, and led her to discovering this collection, because sometimes collections which local small archives preserve may have much larger impact on larger society, and also especially here in Vermont, where we think we are so just similar, that we look similarly, that we just act similarly, that we are so homogeneous. This collection shows that if we search and look, it's actually history is much more diverse than we presume, and it's wonderful to find these tidbits of information to deliver and to realize how different we are and how rich history actually is if we look for it actively. So that's all.
So we have one question. How old was Charity when she died?
So she was born 77 and died in 51. So 77, 23, 74. Yes.
And then we have a comment saying my 3rd great grandparents, Sam and Lucy Jewett of Waybridge, were probably friends with Charity and Sylvia. They were members of the Waybridge Hill Cemetery.
Yes.
Have you read The History of Waybridge by Ida Washington?
Yes, I did, and the exhibit which I curated was about Solomon Jewett and spirit photography, and Jewetts are, there are many Jewetts I kind of read about, so that's very interesting, and I think there was maybe even some intermarriage at some point, but I'm not clear about that. Yes.
And then just another comment that Aunt Sylvia Drake was one of the signatories of the Waybridge Benevolent Society's constitution, as were several Hagar women.
Yes. Yes, Sarah Hagar was one of them, and I think a daughter, another sister maybe of Sarah Hagar. I think there were a couple of Hagars there, yes.
And then a question, is Drake Road in Waybridge named after Sylvia or the Drake family?
I think it's after, I don't know specifically, but I'm pretty sure it's after Asaph, because he was a prominent person there. So most likely it was Asaph, but maybe we can find out.
Eva, I love all of the little hints that you point out about gender identity and expression through the documents, and how it appears that Charity was the butch member of the couple, and Sylvia was more femme. Yeah. And I find that fascinating how that carries on through generations of women couples up until the present day, and that it has such a long history around gender expression. I don't know if you want to comment on that at all, but I that's almost more interesting to me than the fact that they were a couple, was this gender expression.
I really would prefer not to venture there, because I feel like Rachel Hope, it's such analyzes it and with such scholarly insight. And I think her book is so wonderful and readable, and talks about it in a very sort of open fashion, and she contextualizes it. So I think, but you can see it with even this kind of roller coaster, quick run through all these documents, how all of this is in plain view if you look, and you don't really have to search, particularly even in commentaries of contemporaries. Yes, like William Cullen Bryant speaks very clearly about comments about how one was more like that and the other was more like that. So these kind of traditional roles are emphasized even in his description. But also there's another comment that although they seem to carry this traditional role, like male does this, female does cooking, male does cutting of clothes, female finishes. I think I also forgot to say that all these clothes are made by hand, because it was made before sewing machine came in 1850s, was introduced. So everything was made by hand, unbelievable amount of work. And obviously Sylvia was the one who was doing it, not Charity. Charity just cut. So it's kind of almost hilarious to listen how these roles were divided, but at the same time they appear always, sharing equally their income and their property, and whatever they did, it's equally shared. Not necessarily that male member of family inherit as it used to be, and women were basically, didn't have right to property and to inherit anything. Usually property was passing from man to man. So when you think about that, and also this name Silence of her poor mother, Charity's poor mother, is to me like heartbreaking. Even it's a beautiful name, but it's kind of also indicative what woman's role was supposed to be at the time. So
we've had a few more questions come in. Was there safety for Sylvia and Charity to live in a small town like Waybridge rather than a city like Boston where they might have anonymity?
Well, this is an interesting question, and I think that's why this collection is so valuable, and that's what also the author of the book talks, that's what we presumed always, that gay couple would rather live in anonymity of big town. But it wasn't always necessarily. I think there are some examples how it wasn't necessarily so, and because of their special skills and abilities, they were able to be accepted in Waybridge, in this little town. Maybe not all people in their situation would be able to exist like that, because they would be in hiding or pretending. And here they were kind of in the open, living together, probably not expressing affection, because it wasn't anything people did. And also I always think they didn't demand rights. That's what created later on and recently such backlash against gay people, because they demanded rights and to be legally married, and they didn't demand anything. They just existed and were accepted and played important role, and maybe because of it they survived unharmed.
Someone asks if you could put the full citation for Rachel's book in the title and full name in the chat for people.
Yes.
I put a link to it in there from Brain Pickings that has all the details you would need. You can get it from local bookstores, from the Sheldon Museum, and if you must, Amazon.
And then someone asked, can you say more about their family reactions? You mentioned a parent having hesitation about visiting, but many family members ended up being supportive.
Yes, I think, there were so many brothers and sisters on both sides that your head is spinning, and then nieces and nephews. I know that mother was very much uncomfortable, but later visited them. Asaph also at times may have been uncomfortable, but also there was this issue of when you visited, men wanted to visit with a man, and they were just two women. So maybe some brothers and spouses of sisters felt kind of uncomfortable because you come to a woman's home, and what do you do? What do you talk about? So there was this discomfort, and it, I think, fluctuated. Obviously, earlier on, Charity was very much, there was a lot of hurt because of her independence. I just realized also one other aspect of it, not only that these women were gay women, but also the fact that they were single women. So prior, when they were together, a single woman who was over 20 was kind of a dangerous woman, yes, and especially the one who would who was independent and interested in literature or had some other interests than trying to have a husband and bear children. So I think in general, it's a kind of statement about women at some point of life and their limited abilities to really function in society, and incredible judgment about character, and you had to watch yourself at all times. And we have many examples of other women being really hostile towards and not accepting of this individual pursuit of happiness or whatever lifestyle. So there were, but many family members also accepted them. I know that they paid for number of nephews and nieces to go to school. So they supported financially these kind of rural families, which was, I don't know if you pay, they like you, or whether they were, but they had to be genuinely liked and loved, and especially their headstone. There is a story about the headstone that when there was a niece's husband, I forgot his name, who really didn't like Sylvia very much, and they had some conflict. But when she died, he was the one who splurged, I think, $10 more at the time, quite a lot, to really give them this beautiful, headstone to commemorate them. So I think human relations are complicated, and it's hard to know what's in people's heads sometimes. So.
Are there any examples of clothing they made?
That is another big question. We have at the Sheldon sizable collection of textiles and also hand-stitched textiles, but we don't know of any that specifically Charity or Sylvia. They clearly didn't make labels. And my feeling is that because it was a rural community, people wore these clothes until they fell apart. So it's not something, they didn't make some beautiful gowns for princesses to be deposited later in the museum. So we don't know of any.
Are any of the letters on exhibit at the museum?
No, but no, because we had an exhibit in 2014 when the book was published, and Rachel Hope Cleaves was invited. We collaborated with Middlebury College. They brought her to give a talk, and we had an exhibit at the time, and it was the only exhibit which I work on, and the letters and a number of documents were on display. Not since. But we have a finding aid. If anybody is interested, I really encourage that you get in touch with me directly, and I'd be happy to make this collection accessible. I think this collection is really a fantastic collection to be really fully digitized and available to everybody, because it's hiding in boxes, and that's unfortunate.
Considering they were active in the local church, is there any writing by the clergy that would have indicated an accepting attitude within the congregation?
These religious issues are not my forte, I have to say. I know that Charity, there was some, she had to, that was a time of religious revivalism, incredibly, so it was just, it was very hard to be truly perfect member of congregation. And I know that both women struggled with this, and especially Charity had to make some confession about some sort of, I really don't know this part, I have to say. It's I never really delved into, but they were involved, and they had great friendships with ministers, but obviously people in congregation, it wasn't a monolith, so I'm sure there were some conflicts, and there is some information in the collection to follow up on.